My name is Ted Gayer. I am the Executive Vice President at Brookings, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our event today on the future of American Indian gaming. This event is organized by my colleague Randy Akey, who I had the good sense to recruit to Brookings when I was previously the head of the Economic Studies program. I see my other colleague I had the good sense of recruiting here too, Marcus, so welcome to Marcus also. They are both part of our first cohort of Rubenstein Fellows, which takes as one of its primary goals to expand the range of perspectives and topics that we explore here at Brookings. And I remember early in Randy's tenure here at Brookings, we were discussing the idea of an event on American Indian policies. At that time, I was of the view that this important community had been totally neglected in Brookings' work. And it turns out that I was mostly right, but it also turns out that mostly right is technically wrong. At Brookings, we have an intrepid research librarian, Sarah Chilton, who helps us discover all sorts of new things about our 100-year-old plus institution. And she dug up for us something I did not know, and that I now know that in the late 1920s, Brookings, which was then known as the Institute of Government Research, issued a survey of the economic and social conditions of American Indians. The report was known as the Merriam Report, since it was led by Lewis Merriam. And again, digging up lots of Brookings history, Lewis Merriam is my predecessor because he was the vice president of this institution. I'm supposed to have two images on the screen, but apparently we can only fit one. We need a bigger screen. Apparently that's not big enough. But we dug up some images, or Sarah did, I should say, of the Brookings team as they conducted their field research. The picture you don't see was from 1926 on the site of the Coolidge Dam in San Carlos, Arizona. And the one that we decided to put up with Miriam is actually second from the left. Everyone has their hat, of course. Was taken in 1927. The caption that we have for the picture, it was the Hobie Lumber Camp. And so I did what anybody would do when coming across a location that they never heard of. I went on Google. And I had an experience that I don't think I've ever had in Google, because Google couldn't tell me where the Hobie Lumber Camp is, so maybe some of you know about that. But nonetheless, this is the team at work for that first report on the Merriam Report. Many of you are probably familiar with the Merriam Report. I've since learned about it. It was seminal research that, among other things, led to the end of the general allotment policy, which had sought to break up the communal Indian land by allocating allotments to individual Indian households. As pleased as I am to learn that Brookings, about this Brookings history, I still hold the view that as an institution, we have not given enough attention to American Indian and Native American policies, which is why I'm especially pleased that we're gathered here today to examine the long-term effects of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988 and to look forward to the next 30 years for the gaming industry and its impacts on American Indian tribal nations, its citizens, and adjacent jurisdictions. So welcome again, and I look forward to an exciting and stimulating set of discussions today. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Randy Akey. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Ted, for welcoming us. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we're all on the ancestral homelands of the Piscataway people in this area that we now call Washington, D.C. I want to welcome all of you to this really exciting and novel event, the future of Indian gaming. And as is custom, I'll just give a very short prayer to start our event. E pule kako, Ke akua mana loa I loko kalani, e haawi mai ia mākou, I keia la, I ka aho nui, I ka ho'omanawa nui, a me ka na'auau, a me ka ike. Mahalo piha no neia la, a mama ua no. I just said, thanks to the Creator. Thanks, for bringing us all together and give us some, insight and knowledge today, and generosity to one another as well. And I'm pretty sure this is probably the first time the Hawaiian language has been spoken at Brookings. So I think today is going to be, there will be a lot of firsts here. So I want to give you sort of just a very brief overview of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. There's much to be said. One of the interesting things of it, of the act, is that the purposes of the revenues are really sort of public-oriented, and that's what differentiates the industry from that of the commercial industry, and many people in this room know that. But for the broader audience, it's a very unique undertaking. It's public-oriented, public-minded in that sense, so it differs in tremendous ways. And just to show you the uniqueness of the industry, when the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was authorized in 1988, the industry was quite low. It's the dark blue line there. But over the last 30 years, you see that it's really risen. It's again, the blue line. It's about $32 billion today, right, on the revenues annually. And so it eclipses that of several other existing non-American Indian operations, such as lotteries and other types of gaming operations, and it's approaching that of the commercial industry as a whole. So it's a big player here, but it has a particular focus that differs from the private commercial side, and that's where the wealth of interesting things exists. There's a history there over these 30 years, and most of the people in this room have fought that fight and brought it to where it is today, so I'm not going to talk about that. But the reason we're here today is to talk about the next 30 years and where the industry is going, and that's sort of the idea here. The purpose is to really sort of bring together a diverse group of individuals to elicit their thoughts, insights on where this industry is going in the next few decades. We'll hear from individuals who represent the gaming industry regulators, the officials, tribal government officials, US federal agencies, academics, and other researchers. I know this audience also includes lots of people with diverse experiences and vantage points of this industry. And we hope to include a bunch of you as well in the question and answer period when we open up the discussions. And I just want to remind everyone gently that when asking a question can consist of a single sentence. And what we're going to do here today is discuss emerging issues and obstacles that potentially lie in the way of the industry and other potential topics of concern. Again, there are many perspectives represented here today: the industry, the individual tribes, tribal citizens, but also the workforce, which increasingly are also non-native themselves. So there's a lot of ways in which this industry is integrated into the community and the fabric of the United States and adjacent counties within the US. Our keynote speech and the first panel will really discuss various aspects of that, and they'll help us lead into discussing new areas and topics of concern. I see this as the beginning of a broad discussion on American Indian gaming industry and in identifying ways in which we can support better research that informs policymaking at all levels of government, whether it be at tribal, state, or federal levels. There are resources in this room and this potential network that may never have encountered one another previously, and that's sort of the benefit of the convening power of Brookings, bringing diverse voices and perspectives together. And so I'm happy that we're able to do this today. This is a very unique event for Brookings, but also for many of us. We'll have a fantastic keynote talk, then 2 lively panels, and then following that, I'll invite all of you to have lunch with us in the adjoining room at the end. And so now to sort of conclude, I'm just going to give a brief introduction of the 2 moderators and then the keynote speaker. And so I'll start in reverse order and end with the bio of the keynote speaker. So first, I'd like to introduce Miriam Jorgensen. Miriam, can you identify yourself? She's the research director of the Native Nations Institute at the University of Arizona, and its sister program, the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. You thought you had a hard job. She has 2 jobs at 2 universities across the country, okay? Her areas of specialty are indigenous governance and economic development, with a focus on the ways communities' governance arrangements and social characteristics affect economic development. She's the author or co-author of several influential books in this area, one being The State of Native Nations, which is just a hallmark book on this topic. And she's done amazing work in the US, Canada, and Australia with indigenous communities there. Our second moderator is Professor Catherine Spildy. And Catherine is the professor at San Diego State University. She's also the director of the Sikwan Institute of Tribal Gaming at San Diego State University, and has provided generous support to economic studies, which helps make the work that we do possible here. And just as a disclaimer, I'd like to reiterate Brookings' commitment to independence and underscore that the views expressed today from everyone are theirs and theirs alone. Dr. Spilde is one of the foremost experts in American Indian gaming and the government-owned casinos in the U.S. with extensive work, and she's done extensive work in American Indian economic development and tribal government casinos. She was a staff writer for the National Gaming Impact Study that produced a report for the President Clinton in 1999. And she holds the endowed chair of the Sikwan Institute of Tribal Gaming at San Diego State. Finally, I'd like to introduce the National Indian Gaming Commission Chair, Jonadev Chowdhury. Jonadev, can you identify yourself? Sorry, this is Kate Spilde here. I forgot to have her introduce herself, or show herself. Chair Chowdhury was nominated by President Barack Obama to become the chair of the NIGC in 2015. He has held an appointment on the commission since 2013, however. Prior to that, he worked for the Department of Interior as a senior counselor for the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs, and he's worked on various topics of Indian gaming, economic development, Alaskan affairs, and tribal recognition. Chairman Chowdhury served as a judge on 5 different tribal courts, including the Chief Justice of the Muskogee Creek Nation Supreme Court, of which he is a member. He holds a JD from Cornell Law School, but most importantly, he holds a BA from Dartmouth College, my alma mater. So with that, please join me in welcoming Chair Chowdhury.
Mado, Professor Aki, Sagan Masit, Ibafunga Amalgat Butmitus. Let's all be of one mind today, and Creator bless this presentation. Many thanks to Professor Aki, as well as Brookings in general, for holding this incredible forum today. We're among many friends who care deeply about the future of the Indian gaming industry, not just because of the commercial benefits that Indian gaming has brought to Indian country, but for the strengthened voice and strengthened nation building that Indian gaming has brought. Many thanks to Brookings and Professor Aki. Yes, we did know each other back in the day, but let me just say, I knew Randy before he was a big shot at Brookings, and I can say from the bottom of my heart, he's always been a nerd. He loves this stuff. No, but a nerd, very grounded in his traditions, and very grounded in his commitment to do good things, not just for the people of Hawaii, but also all Native people and all people across these lands. So the land recognition today was very touching and heartfelt. I'm going to try and keep my comments short because I want to open up the time if there are any questions here, but I always start with an acknowledgement of my team. Have our Chief of Staff here, Christina Thomas, as well as our Compliance Director, Dustin Thomas, they're not related, and representative from our Office of General Counsel here, Steve Iverson. The reason I always acknowledge them is I want us to be as accessible and approachable as possible, because as regulators, we do have an important job in charting trends in Indian gaming, understanding the importance of regulation and compliance, but also having an eye toward the future. Our team is steeped in the commitment to apply and implement IGRA in a manner that we believe is consistent with the congressional intent that existed in '88, and that was specifically, explicitly to support strong tribal governments, tribal economic development, and tribal self-sufficiency. We always point out the fact that these are self-determination goals that were injected and referenced explicitly by Congress by choice. IGRA didn't happen by accident. At the time, there were voices on both the pro-tribal sovereignty side as well as, frankly, the anti-tribal sovereignty side, trying to sway Congress to inject language in one direction or the other that reflected kind of historical policy fluctuations. And let me talk about that a bit. In '88, when the act was passed, as many of us know, it came on the heels of the California versus Cabazon decision, the watershed Supreme Court decision, in which the Supreme Court upheld the inherent authority of tribal nations to regulate gaming activities on their own lands. It came out it came from a number of separate litigation matters that bubbled up to the Supreme Court level. The case itself compiled both the Morongo's claims as well as Cabazon's, and at the same time, though, there was litigation going on with the Seminole, Florida. There was litigation going on with a number of tribes in the Northeast, and the tribal sovereignty won out. The Supreme Court distinguished the gaming cases, the gaming arguments from a long body of tobacco case law, and held that there were fundamental distinctions between gaming and other types of economic development that supported the inherent regulatory authority of tribal nations. It was a big case. In the year after that, various folks ran to Congress asking for further legislative clarification over the regulatory landscape of Indian gaming. Some of those voices wanted gaming to be primarily regulated by states. Many of those voices wanted to severely restrict tribal sovereignty so that gaming, to the extent it was conducted by Indian nations at all, was primarily overseen by state governments. On the other side, I always try to give thanks to folks from the advocacy community, from the nonprofit community. There were folks who are now involved with the National Indian Gaming Association, but this is before the formation of that, who strongly advocated, along with tribal leaders, that the principles of self-determination and sovereign control over tribal economic matters needed to be maintained and retained in any congressional action. Fortunately, those voices won out. However, IGRA did reflect several compromises and several nods to folks who were coming from the perspective of advocating for state regulation. And those compromises are best reflected in the the three classes of gaming that were created, and the role of states that IGRA carved out in the compacting process. So at NIGC, we always point out that we understand that Indian gaming existed long before the passage of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. We understand that IGRA didn't give anything to tribes. In fact, it restricted tribal authorities, it restricted tribal sovereignty over certain conduct of Class 3 gaming. At the same time, IGRA made explicit reference to tribes being the primary beneficiaries of their operations and tribes being the primary regulators of their operations. And those ideas are reflected in the very first paragraph of IGRA, both in the finding section as well as the statement of public policy. Both of those sections, before you get into any of the stuff that talks about protecting against bad actors or protecting or ensuring the integrity of operations, the finding section of IGRA first and foremost states forth that the purpose of the statute is to support tribal self-sufficiency, tribal economic development, and strong tribal government. So we see that as our lodestar, our guiding star in the implementation of IGRA. We see everything within IGRA in terms of our regulatory authority, our compliance responsibilities, our enforcement authorities as a means to a greater end. And that end is supporting, at the end of the day, self-determination. Yes, protecting the general public is important, but that is part of protecting the integrity of an industry that is so critical to supporting self-determination. So that's how we see IGRA mandating our charge at NIGC, but I think those lessons, that view is helpful in today's discussion. Talked about the Merriam Report. The Merriam Report helped provide some tangible data, tangible structure that helped inform policy moving forward. As I mentioned before, IGRA reflected the balancing of voices who were coming from two conceptual starting places, and American federal Indian policy has always reflected an oscillation between these two forces. On one hand, you have assimilationist forces who I think, right or wrong, firmly believe that the best path forward for Indian country is to assimilate into broader American cultural norms. And that mindset has created policies such as the assimilation policies of the late 1800s. It's led to policies such as the termination policies and the termination and relocation policies of the 50s and 60s. On the other side, there are the self-determination policies that flowed from the Merriam Report, self-determination policies that are reflected in the Indian Reorganization Act, acts such as Indian Child Welfare Act, acts such as Violence Against Women Act. These self-determination principles all reflect the idea that not only should tribes have authority, jurisdictional authority over activities within their lands, but tribes themselves are best suited to understanding the needs and solutions for matters within their lands. So there are these two oscillating poles of policy that at various times within the federal statutory landscape, Congress has tilted towards one or the other. We're happy to say, as regulators, we have a privileged post to see the product of how those philosophies have played out in the actual application of regulatory law. So let me talk about that very briefly. In the 30 years since IGRA was passed, and IGRA is the same statute that created our agency, we've had a front row seat at really kind of assessing the products of that referendum. We've seen, especially in the Class 2 area, the product of tribal regulation and supporting and empowering tribal decision-making when it comes to the passage of regulation as well as the enforcement of compliance violations at the outset by tribal nations. And we as regulators can say that that framework works. It works. But we need more, on top of the clear evidence through our regulatory acts, we need more data to show that in the next 30 years that approach is going to work. But let me talk about the evidence that we do have. Professor Aki mentioned that we're a $32.4 billion industry. That is absolutely the case. We can't, as a federal regulatory agency, we can't necessarily cite privately collected or nonprofit collected numbers in our reports to Congress. However, we are mindful of the reports that groups such as NIGA have compiled that show that the direct and indirect impacts of Indian gaming on the larger economic landscape exceed $100 billion. So our $32.4 billion number that we produce at NIGC reflects the submissions of financial statements from all gaming tribes throughout the country. We're rock solid on those numbers. But the economic impact numbers that NIGA provides shows the indelible imprint of Indian gaming on the American economic landscape across the board. However, those numbers show that all they show is that Indian gaming is a big deal, and we all know that's a big deal. But we're proud of the fact that in the day-to-day work we do as regulators, working hand in hand with the primary regulators of Indian gaming, namely tribal regulation, by and large, the boogeymen that were part of the congressional discussion in the late 80s have not materialized. And those boogeymen are the folks with the fedoras and the cigars and, folks in back rooms with dark sunglasses. The specter of large-scale organized crime has never been an issue. Why? Because tribal regulators have the most interest in protecting tribal assets and operations and have worked hand in hand with federal regulators to make sure that organized crime's been kept at bay. So we have the anecdotal proof that we have a $32.4 billion industry, but we need more data to drive policy moving forward. We had an event a couple months ago where we've reflected on the last 30 years of Indian gaming, and we brought up the fact that as regulators we have seen the product of 30 years of supporting tribal decision-making work, and we hope that these concepts that lean towards the self-determination end of the spectrum inform policy moving forward. As we all know, public policy exists in an echo chamber with public perception. The work that we're doing today and discussing how data can be analyzed and collected more efficiently and effectively impacts both. So one data point that I always want to mention is, despite the big deal number of $32.4 billion, according to our numbers, over 60% of operations are small to modest operations. That's 60% of gaming operations receive $25 million or less in gross revenue. That's not net, that's gross. You still have to pay for everything that any business runs. These are small operations, but are important operations for jobs, for local communities, for providing emergency services to native communities and non-natives alike. That number, that 60% number, flies in the face of the rich Indian stereotype that's out there. And the casino Indian, the rich casino Indian stereotype can be seen in large-scale publications such as Wampum, or there's one John Grisham book that came out recently about tribal casinos. I would submit that attacking those public perceptions of Indian gaming are just as important as advocating among policymakers, advocating on the Hill, advocating for various federal agencies. But whether you're talking about the arenas of public perception or the arenas of public policy, data matters, and having rock-solid data that helps establish the benefits to not just native communities, but surrounding communities that Indian gaming provides is extremely important. So, the next 30 years of Indian gaming, as we said last October at our event, the future is not yet written. The future could be dictated by advocates for more state control, whether it's in the sports betting arena or whatever the next policy discussion is down the pike, or it could be driven by folks who understand, just as folks who understood the Merriam Report understood, that self-control, self-regulation, and empowerment of tribal nations to truly exercise their sovereignty can govern a successful path forward, not just for Native nations, but for the American public as a whole. We've seen that as regulators, and I thank you all for this important discussion today. Maro.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.